Counter-Narrative News, bringing you not only a week in review, but really 2 decades in review, in the sense we're looking back at why the anti-war movement failed around opposing the US and British initiated conflict and then invasion, occupation, and basically the destruction of Iraq. In and around the 15th February 2003 protest, which was the biggest protest that Britain had ever seen, and very much around major capitals and cities across the world, it was often the biggest protest that these countries had seen as well. So why did the anti-war movement fail in having any kind of negative impact on the attack on Iraq? We would like to point people towards the first part of this 3-part series reviewing the last 20 years of the anti-war movement. The first part really looks at anti-war politics and behavior of the British and US state in terms of its global reach of state violence across the world. So that's part 1. This part really focuses on why the anti-war movement failed itself, and the third part, which will come out in the 20th anniversary for the actual onset of the attack on Iraq, which was March the 20th, 2003, will focus on the Iraqi people's response and their resistance to this invasion and occupation and the machinations and politics around that. The third part will probably come out on the Friday, March the 19th, next month, in relation to March the 20th anniversary. So really, this is quite a long and quite complex issue. And just to sum up, really, the reason the anti-war movement failed around the protest of the 15th of February 2003 and onwards and before was really 5 or 6 issues. 1, it was a failure of the anti-war movement and leadership to understand the nature of the British state and how it permanently exports violence across the world because of the nature of its political economic state. Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, said, quote unquote, imperialism means war. That it's the capitalist colonial states that have really conquered the entire world, and due to competition and also resistance from the colonized and oppressed masses, they can only redivide the world in accordance to violence, i.e. war. So really, the anti-war movement did not understand that the British state has this type of nature and it has to be explained to people what it is and to be opposed. The second thing connected to that is the reformism of the anti-war leadership and the way it continuously tried to put pressure on the party of war, the party that led the conflict, the Labour Party, the party in government under the leadership of the Prime Minister Tony Blair and his kind of right-wing oriented New Labour project. So it really, the anti-war movement just wants to put pressure on the media, wants to engage nearly constructively, although critically, with the media and the ruling political class, and that obviously was going to not really achieve much considering the other fundamental flaws of it. It has to also be said the people who led the anti-war movement were failures of the left in England and Britain anyway. They failed to achieve any uptick of class struggle amongst oppressed and exploited communities here. They failed to really mobilize oppressed communities in black and brown diasporic communities here as well. So the third thing is, as well, there was no support by the anti-war leadership in and around the repression that particularly Muslim communities faced in relation to the anti-Muslim racism around Islamophobic policies, very much around the Terrorism Act and other so-called anti-terror legislation, the general hyped up, intense atmosphere of racism against these communities, the targeting of often, not only, but often young Muslim people opposing the war in solidarity with resistance in Palestine and Iraq and Afghanistan. There was just an absence of the anti-war movement and leadership coming to the defense and support of people being targeted by the British intelligence services and the police, facing charge and court proceedings and even imprisonment and guilty verdicts around that. There was an absence of that. Fourth, there was no direct action strategy by the anti-war movement and its leadership, despite the rhetoric of some of its leaders, Bob Crow advocating for occupying industries, quote unquote, in the advent of the war in Iraq. Nothing happened, despite his rhetoric. George Monbiot arguing to, quote unquote, make Britain ungovernable on the outset of the British state and US state violence and terrorism against Iraq. Again, Monbiot did nothing, and nothing happened around that. Fifth was really an absence of incorporating the black community in anti-war strategies and advocacy and organizing, and also African diasporic communities as well, despite the fact that New Labour conducted a war, an invasion against Sierra Leone in West Africa, and also what we know very clearly, and was clear at the time as well, that Britain wanted to conduct a quote-unquote regime change operation against Zimbabwe. And we know now, because the leader of South Africa at the time, Thabo Mbeki, has made it known in recent years that he opposed explicitly Tony Blair trying to include him and to collaborate in a regime operation project against Harare. So again, that was just never referenced in the anti-war movement. Black communities were not included in analysis and advocacy, in mobilizing, in recruitment, an absence of that, and also connected to that, an absence of understanding how the African diasporic communities in Palestine and also Iraq fit into the struggle of liberation of these people and resistance against Western domination and colonization. None of that was there really. And all of these problems really come to its logical conclusion and disaster with the NATO 2011 operation against Libya, in which leading elements of the anti-war movement end up supporting the NATO proxies who mass lynched and massacred and genocided black communities across Libya, most notably the Tawargan community of 40,000 black Libyans near the town of Misrata, but also the targeting of black African people by NATO proxies in 2011 with elements of the anti-war movement explicitly in support. People like Richard Seymour of so-called Lenin's Tomb blog, John Rees, who was a Stop the War Coalition leader, all coming out explicitly in support of the lynchers at the time in spring and summer of 2011. Okay, so to develop these points a little bit further. So really, there was around 1 million people came out on 15th of February 2003 in the anti-war protest. There were direct actions in localities and by certain more radical sections of the anti-war movement. For example, there's a really well-known action against RAF Fairford, from which aircraft bombers were going to Iraq to conduct their neo-colonial massacres. And it was mostly white, radical, anarchist-oriented, radical left-oriented people who were targeting RAF Fairford, and then they were arrested under the Terrorism Act 2000. They were detained, and arrested, and they were actually driven back down the M4 from Fairford to London while being detained in a police convoy and British intelligence services convoy down the motorway back to London. The Stop the War leadership totally marginalized the people involved in this action, really just pushed it away, kept it at arm's length, and really de facto helped to facilitate the British state repression against the what would have been more effective tactics against the war machine. Now, up to the early 2000s, the NATO operation against Serbia in 1999 recruited far-right and right-wing nationalist elements from the Serbian community, and also related to that, the right-wing and far-right nationalist communities around the Russian and the emerging Vladimir Putin leadership. But with 9/11, what you have is really you have the counter-opposites in these conflicts in the Muslim community being recruited into the anti-war movement because of 9/11 and the NATO operation against Afghanistan in late 2001, and then rolling into Iraq and also the Palestinian Intifada. So you have a supremacist community on the Serbian Russian nationalist side, but then you have, after 9/11 and Afghanistan and Iraq and Palestine, you have not all of them, but in the Middle Eastern, North African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities, you have a section of that who also hold supremacist views, using and abusing Islam. So you have a big shift from Serbia 99 to 9/11, Afghanistan and Iraq, early 2000s in the anti-war movement. And this really brings a lot of problematics because clearly the anti-war leadership did not know how to navigate this whatsoever, did not put up infrastructure to develop more clear kind of dialectical and materialist understandings of the class nature of the British and US state and how that can be resisted within the colonial centre and also in the periphery in the global south communities and nations impacted. To develop this point further, really, so you have on the anti-war protests young people, not only Muslims but others as well, being arrested by the police, being detained and harassed under the Terrorism Act and criminalized. And you have scenes like, literally people trying to sell magazines in support of the Palestinian Lebanese resistance being harassed by the intelligence services and police, and the organizers really just choosing not to do anything around that whatsoever. So leaving people in this vulnerable situation in relation to repression. Now, George Galloway, who more recently has become a collaborator with the far right in his alliances with Nigel Farage and Steve Bannon and Alexander Dugin and Putin, etc. But back in the early 2000s, he forms the Respect Party and coalition with Salma Yaqub and some Trotskyists and other radical left elements. But they too fail to really develop a kind of educational avenues and projects to educate a new generation of people into radical anti-imperialism and anti-colonial ideas. They somewhat opportunistically really just try and recruit some Muslim communities into their project without contending with the more problematic aspects of their own politics and these communities' politics as well. And this all comes to a disastrous logical conclusion, which we'll come to shortly, around the NATO project against Libya in 2011. However, the Respect Party initiative did have some positive potential and aspects to it. It did shift things to a more radical leftist, anti-imperialist leadership, but they just did not have the forces in the organization to really push it in a grassroots way in terms of its practical work in communities and its political work. It was still really captured by opportunistic political elements of George Galloway himself and also Salma Yaqub, and on the other hand, the Socialist Workers' Party, which opportunistically tried to colonize many struggles of oppressed and working class communities, but always deposit it into strategic failures and disasters. So going back to the lack of support of young people being criminalized and demonized and repressed by the British state, you have a few years later around the opposition to Operation Cast Lead in the winter of 2008-2009, where Tel Aviv conducted a massacre against the occupied and oppressed people of Palestinian people of Gaza. You had some relatively radical protests at the Israeli embassy, people being arrested and charged with public disorder charges, going through the criminal justice system with no support from the anti-war movement and the leadership of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign itself. But then what happens, interestingly, with the outset of the NATO conflict in Libya is the fruition of all the failures of the anti-war movement. When NATO attacks Libya, you have the anti-war leadership in the form of the Stop the War Coalition explicitly coming out in support of the lynchers and the militias and the death squads allied to NATO, with as aforementioned, Richard Seymour coming out in support of them, who's a prominent figure coming out of the SWP political community, John Rees similarly so as well. And similar politics they applied to the Syria conflict. Now, British collusion with these supremacist forces in the Muslim world go back generations, if not centuries, in terms of like the British creation of the Saudi Arabian state and other supremacist, neo-colonial and colonial entities in the Gulf there. But up until 2011, British politicians the legislation and the mainstream media said Al-Qaeda and similar political forces were the existentialist enemies of the West. But when the Libya conflict happens, the mainstream media and the leading politicians openly and explicitly celebrate and advocate and push forward the same political communities they were demonizing in the form of Al-Qaeda and then what's emerging with Daesh, or the wrongly named Islamic State. They come out in explicit support with them in the Libya and then the NATO attack on Libya in 2011. And then the Stop the War coalition leadership support these same forces. So you see this racket and this corruption and this collusion that encompasses the leading body in this relationship, which is the British state, then colluding with these supremacist forces and death squads and proxy militias, etc., and then the Stop the War coalition all supporting these very same forces explicitly until Daesh make it a little bit too embarrassing for them by late 2012, 2013, by Daesh's sordid, disgusting, violent actions. Then you have a kind of a bulking and moving away. Interestingly, John Rees, for example, he supported the NATO death squads, proxy death squads in Libya 2011, very much justified that, added Richard Seymour. And then you have this really crazy spectacle around the Jihadi John and Cage organization. Cage is a front organization for the supremacist politics of Al-Qaeda, Daesh type political communities here. You have John Rees in a press conference next to these Cage organization leaders, talking about how a violent death squad operative was a lovely man, quote unquote, and he brought us posh baklava. And you have John Rees there looking a little bit awkward, but he very much decided to take that political positioning. And very interesting, of course, that in this project of British state collusion, that that John Rees has not really been exposed as being part of this collusion racket. And why would the state do that? Because obviously it's involved in this very deceitful and covert operations in this regard. So really that gives you an idea of how the anti-war movement just could not move these things forward. And really the failure of February the 15th, 2003 has informed politics in a very negative way ever since, because people understood that the simple notion was, well, if so many people, the majority of people opposed this major conflict that Britain initiated in relation to Iraq, then what's the point of politics at all? So it had a deep, profound, demoralizing effect amongst people's notions and potential for involving themselves in anything effective politically in opposing the state. And there's other complexities around that. So that was Counter-Narrative News, bringing you really 2 decades in review in our week in review about why the anti-war movement failed. So to sum up again, it was a failure to see the nature of the British state as a warring entity for centuries because of the nature of its capitalist and colonial state. That's 1. 2, the reformism of the anti-war movement and the constant futile pressuring of mainstream politics and media in that regard, conducted by those who are failing the grassroots communities in this country anyway. 3, no support for communities facing repression and being targeted by the state in terms of policing and intelligence services. 4, no direct action strategy, despite some hypocritical and arguably manipulative rhetoric towards that by the leadership. 5, an absence of incorporating the African continent and its diaspora in terms of the British state's agenda of violence overtly across Africa, especially in the cases of Sierra Leone and Zimbabwe and others, and a failure to apply the same type of analysis of anti-white supremacy, black liberation politics to Iraq and Palestine as well. Thank you for listening. Please do continue to support us by encouraging your networks and contacts to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter at @counter_CNN. We wish you a wonderful day.